The grind of a perfect life. Ray Thompson's mornings were a reflection of his life, rushed, structured, and almost predictable. Every weekday, without fail, he followed the same routine. At exactly 7:15 a.m., he'd leave his apartment, phone in hand, scrolling through emails or checking the latest stock updates. His apartment was a neat, minimalist space in the heart of the city, a monument to his single-minded ambition. It was too expensive for the salary of a junior partner at a growing firm, but it was necessary. After all, success wasn't just about what you did, it was about what you had, and how you presented it. He lived alone, his fridge mostly empty, save for the occasional protein bar or ready-to-eat meal. The social life he once imagined himself having had faded into the background, replaced by late-night office work and endless meetings. Friends had become distant acquaintances, and his family had long ago stopped questioning his schedule. The bus stop at the corner of 12th and Pine was always busy at that hour. The crowd was a sea of black suits, sharp heels, and phones constantly in use, all heading to offices with the same relentless goal: success. Ray often noticed the same faces in the crowd, but he didn't bother to get to know any of them. He wasn't there to make friends. He was there to make his mark. The number 42 bus was as dependable as the rising sun. It arrived at precisely 7:22 a.m. every day, without fail. Ray had gotten so accustomed to the timing that he could almost feel the bus pulling up before he saw it. It was one of the few things in his life that remained predictable, except when it wasn't. Ray kept track of the delays in a note on his phone, a small act of rebellion against the city's transit system. He often drafted complaints, filling the screen with sharp critiques of inefficiency. But like most things in his life, he never sent them. There was always something more important: another report, another deadline, another presentation to polish. His life was a constant race, and he hated it, but it was the only way he knew how to live. The bus driver was a man named Harold, and Ray had seen him every day for the past few months. A middle-aged black man with a neat uniform and a smile that was almost too sincere for someone working at 7:22 a.m. Harold had a kind face, the kind that made people feel like they were the most important person in the world, even if it was just for a moment. Ray had never paid much attention to him, only enough to notice that his demeanor was always calm, always pleasant, and always unbothered by the hectic world around him. As Ray boarded the bus one morning, Harold greeted him with his usual smile. "Good morning, sir. How are you today?" Ray mumbled something indistinct, not really hearing him. He was too focused on the day ahead, already mentally organizing his tasks. But Harold didn't mind. He'd seen it all before: people lost in their thoughts, heads down, eyes glued to their screens. It didn't bother him. The bus was crowded that morning, as it often was. Ray found his usual spot in the middle, his eyes flicking to the clock as the minutes ticked by. Late again, but it wasn't the bus's fault this time. It was the woman ahead of him, the one fumbling around in her bag for what seemed like an eternity. Ray gritted his teeth, glancing at the time. He would be late for his first meeting of the day if they didn't move soon. "Take your time, ma'am," Harold said, his voice a calm contrast to the growing tension in Ray's chest. "Yeah, some of us have things to do," Ray muttered under his breath, barely aware that he was speaking aloud. The woman didn't seem to hear him, but Harold did. With a patient smile, he hummed a soft tune, a melody so gentle it almost seemed out of place in the cacophony of the morning commute. The seconds stretched into minutes as the woman finally found her bus pass with a triumphant sigh. Harold congratulated her as if she had discovered hidden treasure. Ray's frustration boiled over. 7 minutes behind schedule. He was going to have to skip his morning coffee if he wanted to make it to the office on time. He couldn't afford to be late. Not today. "Must be nice," Ray muttered, loud enough for Harold to hear. "I don't know how you can stand this, just letting people waste time like this." Harold turned his gaze toward Ray, still smiling but with a hint of understanding in his eyes. "Sometimes life throws us curves," he said quietly, his voice soft but firm. but we'll straighten them out together. It's all part of the ride." Ray blinked, taken aback by the words. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He was expecting a quick rebuttal or a defense of the bus system, something to justify the delays. But instead, he got patience, a reminder that life, much like the bus, had its own pace, and sometimes the best thing to do was simply go with it. Ray mumbled something, perhaps an apology, though it didn't feel like one. He sat back in his seat, his mind racing. He had to admit, there was something about Harold's calmness that unsettled him. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he resented it. Why didn't Harold care about punctuality? About success? Why wasn't he rushing through life the way Ray was? As the bus continued its journey, Ray tried to push the thought away. He had more important things to focus on, like the quarterly report he needed to finalize and the presentation he was expected to nail later that day. The rest of the ride passed in an uncomfortable silence, the kind that only exists when you're too aware of your own thoughts. Ray kept stealing glances at Harold through the rearview mirror, but the driver's expression never changed, his calm smile unwavering, his eyes focused on the road ahead. It was then that Ray noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Every time a passenger exited the bus, Harold would wish them a blessed day, and every single person would respond in kind. Except for Ray. He had never responded, and suddenly, it felt like a deliberate choice, one that set him apart from everyone else. It wasn't something he had noticed before, but now, it felt like a subtle reminder that he was different. That maybe he had been too busy, too focused on his own narrow goals to acknowledge the world around him. The realization sat heavy in his chest, like a weight he didn't know how to lift. By the time Ray arrived at his office, the feeling hadn't faded. The elevator ride was long and uncomfortable, and he couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. Something deeper than just being late or missing his coffee. The cracks in the facade. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, but Ray didn't step out right away. His reflection in the polished metal walls caught his attention, and for the first time in years, he truly saw himself. The perfectly pressed suit, the straight tie, the neatly polished shoes, they were all in place, but something about his reflection looked different, off even. His face, pale and weary, betrayed the exhaustion of late nights spent staring at spreadsheets and drafting reports. The bags under his eyes seemed heavier today, like they carried more than just a lack of sleep. There was an unease in his posture too, a slight slouch that wasn't there before. It made him look older than his 30 years. He shook his head, trying to banish the thought. "Focus, Ray," he muttered under his breath. "Get your head in the game." He pushed through the glass doors into the sleek, modern lobby of Parker and Mills Investment Group. The building was a testament to the success he was supposed to represent. It had marble floors and chrome accents, and the windows looked out over the city skyline. It screamed power, influence, and control, everything Ray had worked for. But today, it all felt hollow. His assistant, Emily, looked up from her desk as he entered. She offered him a polite smile, her eyes glancing down at the clock. She didn't need to say anything. Ray knew she noticed the delay. "Morning, Ray. Your 9 a.m. is waiting in the conference room," she said, her tone neutral, professional, but somehow laced with an unspoken tension. "Thanks, Emily," Ray replied, his voice a little more strained than he intended. He headed straight for the conference room, mentally reviewing the presentation he was about to give. The numbers had to be perfect. The graphs, pristine. The delivery, flawless. As he entered the room, he was greeted by a group of executives who looked as sharp and polished as he felt he should. His boss, Marcus Chen, was already sitting at the head of the table, scrolling through his tablet as usual. Marcus was everything Ray aspired to be. Commanding presence, immaculate style, and a relentless drive that demanded respect. "Ah, Ray, good to see you," Marcus said, not looking up from his device. "You're late." Ray stiffened but nodded. "I apologize. Traffic, you know." Happens. Marcus raised an eyebrow, still not looking up. It's always something, isn't it? He muttered. Then, finally, he looked up at Ray. His expression was calm, but there was a sharpness in his gaze that made Ray feel small. You're behind schedule. Your performance has been slipping, Ray. You've missed some critical points. Are you distracted? The words hit Ray like a slap. His mind spun for a moment, trying to figure out how to respond. Distracted? Me? It didn't make sense. He had been doing everything right, hadn't he? He'd been working longer hours than anyone else, chasing every lead, perfecting every document. But Marcus's words lingered in the air, filling the room with a sense of discomfort. I don't understand, Ray said, his voice tight. I'm on top of everything. The clients are happy. The reports are all there. Marcus leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. It's not about the reports, Ray. It's about your approach. You've been nitpicking the details so much that you've lost sight of the bigger picture. The team is noticing it too. You're isolating yourself, becoming obsessed with perfection. Ray wanted to defend himself, to explain that it was precisely the attention to detail that made him valuable to the company, but the words died in his throat. He was realizing, albeit too late, that Marcus was right. He had become so consumed with proving his worth, with chasing the next promotion, that he had forgotten what it was all for. It wasn't about the numbers, the charts, the metrics. It was about people. And somewhere along the way, Ray had stopped seeing them as people. You need to recalibrate, Ray, Marcus continued, his voice colder now. We're going to need you to step back and reassess how you're spending your time. Focus on the things that truly matter. Take the rest of the day off, and come back tomorrow with a clearer perspective. Ray felt the weight of those words sink into his chest. He nodded mechanically, trying to hold on to some semblance of composure as he stood up and left the room. His heart was pounding, his mind racing. Take a step back. Reassess. The words sounded so simple, yet so impossible. What was he supposed to reassess? Everything he had done had been for a reason. It had been for this exact moment. The chance to prove himself, to rise above the competition, to show everyone that he had what it took. But the truth was, he didn't know if he believed it anymore. The ache in his chest, the gnawing feeling that something was wrong, had only grown stronger. Ray spent the rest of the day in a fog. His mind was too distracted to focus on work, and he kept thinking back to the conversation with Marcus. He tried to dive into the next project on his desk, but everything felt flat. His emails, once crisp and efficient, now seemed pointless. His phone notifications, which usually gave him a rush of adrenaline, only served to remind him of the disconnect he was feeling. He couldn't focus on anything, and that gnawing feeling only grew. It wasn't until late afternoon, when the office was starting to clear out, that Ray realized he hadn't had lunch. He hadn't even thought about food. That was when his phone buzzed. It was a reminder. A calendar alert for his 5:30 meeting with a prospective client. Another crucial moment. Ray sighed. He had to get back on track. No more distractions. He grabbed his things and headed toward the elevator, his steps quickening as he approached the door. He was going to nail this meeting. He had to. The day dragged on, but the moment he stepped out of the office building, Ray realized something. He didn't feel that sense of achievement he used to get after a successful meeting or presentation. Instead, all he could think about was the brief interaction he had had with Harold that morning. The bus driver, of all people. Harold's calm, unshakable patience had been a stark contrast to everything Ray had been chasing in his life. Time was a currency, and he was spending it foolishly, Harold had said, in his own way. Ray felt it now, more acutely than ever, the weight of his own choices. Was this the life he wanted? A life where nothing mattered except the next deal, the next promotion, the next deadline. He didn't have an answer, but there was something in the back of his mind that told him he might already know. The next morning, Ray woke up early. It was the first time in years that he had actually set an alarm to get up before he needed to. The clock on his nightstand read 6:00 a.m. He lay there for a few moments, staring at the ceiling, letting the silence wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt clear. It was as if the haze had lifted, just enough to see what was really there. He got up, slowly but purposefully, and prepared for the day ahead. But today there was no rush, no frantic pace. He allowed himself to savor the small moments, the warm water of the shower, the scent of fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen, the hum of the city outside his window. Today was going to be different, a change in perspective. The morning unfolded in a way Ray had never allowed it to before. He didn't rush through his breakfast, didn't stare blankly at his phone, scrolling through emails before his first cup of coffee. Instead, he took a moment to enjoy each step of his routine. The coffee, which had usually been nothing more than a caffeine boost, became something to savor. He could taste the slight bitterness in it, the warmth of it in his hands, and for once he didn't mind that the world around him was waking up slowly. It was as if he had stepped out of autopilot mode for the first time in years. When he left his apartment, the usual rush was gone. The hurried pace of his steps, the clutching of his briefcase, the anxiety of needing to be somewhere, all felt unnecessary. He looked around at the familiar sights of his neighborhood, noticing the small details he'd ignored before, the bright flowers in a window box, the street artist sketching on the corner, the group of old men sitting outside the cafe, laughing over a game of chess. It felt peaceful. Ray had walked the same 3 blocks to the bus stop 1,000 times, but today it was different. He found himself looking up at the sky, watching the clouds shift as the sun rose higher. His mind, usually preoccupied with the weight of expectations and deadlines, was suddenly open. There was space to breathe, space to think. And then, as he approached the bus stop, his thoughts turned back to Harold. Sometimes the best things like to play hide and seek. The words echoed in his mind, still strange and foreign. Ray hadn't been able to shake them all night. He wasn't sure what had gotten under his skin about Harold. After all, the man was just doing his job, wasn't he? But there was something in the bus driver's demeanor, something in the way he carried himself with such calm and generosity, that had cracked open something inside Ray. How could someone be so consistently positive, so unbothered by delays and disruptions? The thought lingered with him as the bus pulled up, its wheels screeching to a halt. Ray glanced at his watch. It was exactly 7:15. The same time it always was, but it felt different today. The bus doors opened, and there was Harold, greeting passengers with his usual bright smile. "Good morning, folks." Harold's voice boomed through the bus, as friendly and welcoming as ever. Ray hesitated for a moment before stepping onto the bus. It wasn't just the fact that he had gotten there early, or that he wasn't running late for once. It was the weight of everything that had happened in the past few days. The meeting with Marcus, his realization that something in his life was missing, and the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, he had been living his life all wrong. "Morning, Harold," Ray said, his voice softer than he intended. He didn't know why it felt important, but something about the interaction felt different today. Like maybe this time, he could finally acknowledge the man as more than just a face in his daily commute. Harold's smile didn't falter as he greeted Ray. "Good to see you, young man. Hop on, and have a blessed day." Ray felt his chest tighten at those words, though he couldn't say why. It wasn't the first time Harold had used them, but today they felt charged with something deeper, something he couldn't yet put into words. He made his way to his usual seat in the middle of the bus, but instead of burying his head in his phone like he normally would, he looked out the window, letting his mind wander. As the bus pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic, Ray couldn't help but notice how the city seemed to come alive around him. The chaos of the morning, the frenetic energy of people hurrying to get to work, was still there. But for once, it didn't feel like something to resist or avoid. It felt like life in all its complexity, its beauty, and its messiness. For the next few days, Ray found himself paying closer attention to the small moments, the things that had once irritated him, but now seemed oddly grounding. When the bus hit a red light, Harold would hum softly, his fingers lightly tapping the steering wheel in time with the rhythm of the song playing through his radio. Sometimes he'd greet a regular passenger by name, or share a quick story about his family or a funny encounter from the previous day. The conversations were never rushed or transactional, never centered around the usual small talk that Ray was accustomed to. Harold's way of interacting with the world was gentle, almost deliberate. He wasn't hurrying to get anywhere, wasn't making small talk for the sake of it. He was simply present. One morning, as the bus drove down Fifth Avenue, Ray found himself in the middle of an internal battle. He had just finished a difficult presentation with a client, one that had left him drained and frustrated. Despite his best efforts, something had gone wrong. He had missed a key point in the proposal, and it was obvious that his client wasn't entirely satisfied. "I should have prepared better." The thought echoed in his head as he sat on the bus, still replaying the conversation in his mind. But as he looked out the window, he noticed something different. For the first time in a long while, he stopped berating himself. Instead of fixating on his failure, he asked himself a new question. What am I missing? He glanced up at Harold through the rearview mirror. The driver was humming again, his expression as calm as ever. He seemed so unaffected by the world's chaos, so steady in his own skin. Ray envied that. The next morning, Ray found himself stepping onto the bus with a new sense of resolve. The usual grind of the morning commute, the cramped sidewalks, the packed bus, the push and shove of commuters, no longer felt like something to endure. Instead, he was ready to embrace it, to be present. "Morning, Harold," Ray said, surprising even himself with how natural it sounded. "Good morning, young man," Harold replied, his smile wide as always. This time, Ray took a moment to notice something he hadn't before. Harold's eyes. They were bright and kind, but there was also something there, something deeper. They told a story of a life lived with patience, of someone who had seen hardships and joy alike, and who had chosen to approach the world with open hands instead of clenched fists. Ray sat down and let the bus continue its journey. But this time, he wasn't looking out the window, lost in thought. He wasn't staring at his phone, trying to check off tasks or emails. Instead, he simply observed. He observed the rhythm of the bus, the way the other passengers moved, the way Harold interacted with each person as they boarded. It was in these small moments, Ray realized, that true success lay. Not in the accolades, not in the promotions or the money, but in the ability to be present, to connect, to care. And for the first time, Ray thought, maybe that was enough. The next day, Ray woke up earlier than usual. He dressed slowly, taking care to notice each detail, each movement. His tie wasn't perfectly straight, but that was okay. He hadn't rushed through his breakfast or skimmed through the headlines. He simply sat, letting the warmth of the coffee seep into his bones, taking his time. When he reached the bus stop, he didn't check his watch. He didn't worry about being late. Instead, he simply watched as the world around him went on, with all its imperfections and beauty. And as the bus rounded the corner and pulled up to the stop, he smiled, genuinely. Ray had made a decision. He wasn't going to let the business of life dictate who he was anymore. He wasn't going to be consumed by deadlines or expectations. He was going to find meaning in the moments that most people rushed past. And in that moment, as the doors of the bus opened and Harold's familiar smile greeted him, Ray realized he had finally started to figure it out. The unseen journey. Ray's mornings were beginning to shift in a way that felt almost foreign. Each day, the world seemed to slow down, but in the best way possible. The chaos of his usual commute, the stressful rush of people, the endless series of emails, the overwhelming noise of the city was still there, but it no longer had a chokehold on him. He had started to take notice of the smallest things, things he had once overlooked in his relentless pursuit of achievement. One afternoon, as Ray sat at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his assistant, Anne. Reminder, your 3:00 meeting with the marketing team. You have 15 minutes to prep. Ray's fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he didn't immediately dive into the usual work frenzy. Instead, he sat back in his chair, letting the weight of his decision sink in. For the past few days, he had been trying something new, a break from the endless hustle, from the self-imposed pressure that had driven him for years. The usual stress that had once defined his workday now seemed distant, even manageable. A soft knock on the door brought him back to the present. Ray. It was Anne, poking her head into his office. Ready for your meeting. He looked up, meeting her gaze. Normally, he would have nodded, grumbled a quick, "Yeah, just give me a minute," and jumped into the meeting with his usual level of intensity. But today, something felt different. "Actually," he said, surprising himself, "let's postpone it by 15 minutes. I need a breather. Tell the team I'll be there shortly." Anne raised an eyebrow. "Sure, Ray. Everything okay?" Ray nodded, a soft smile forming on his face. "Yeah, everything's fine." He wasn't sure why he had said it, maybe because he didn't want to explain how different things had felt lately, or maybe he just didn't need to justify it. But for the first time in a long while, he felt no urgency, no pressure, just a quiet certainty that slowing down for a moment wasn't the end of the world. Anne left, and Ray took a deep breath. The weight of the decision, the shift in his perspective, felt like it was growing stronger every day. He didn't need to be constantly in motion anymore. And what's more, he didn't need to wear his stress like a badge of honor. That afternoon, the marketing meeting went smoothly, better than expected. Ray had walked into the room with an open mind, ready to listen, not just lead. He let the conversation flow naturally, letting his team members express their ideas freely, without the usual interruptions. For the first time in a while, he found himself truly interested in what they had to say. As the meeting wrapped up, his colleague, Sarah, casually mentioned, "You seem different lately, Ray. More relaxed." Ray was caught off guard. It wasn't like him to seem relaxed at work. "Really?" he asked, laughing slightly. "I guess I'm just not in a hurry anymore." Sarah tilted her head, an intrigued smile playing on her lips. "You've been way more present. It's kind of refreshing." Ray didn't know how to respond at first. Was it that noticeable? The change in him? Or maybe it was just that Sarah was the first person to say something. Either way, it made him pause. He hadn't realized how much of his life had been spent with his head down, rushing through it all. Until now. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident. Ray took the time to read through emails more carefully, meet with his team one-on-one instead of skimming over their ideas, and even stepped outside for a walk during his break. He was starting to feel more connected to the world around him, rather than like a spectator who was constantly looking for the next thing. The once chaotic office felt more manageable now, as if Ray had reclaimed his space within it. The following morning, Ray found himself back on the bus. As usual, Harold greeted him with a warm, "Good morning, young man." But today, Ray wasn't the only one who had changed. Harold was different too. "Something on your mind, Ray?" Harold asked casually as he drove. It was the first time he had addressed Ray like that, without any preamble, as though he had sensed something was off. Ray blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "You've been more quiet lately," Harold said with a knowing smile. "Less focused on your phone. Something's shifted, hasn't it?" Ray didn't know how to respond at first. How could Harold, a man who barely knew him, pick up on something so subtle? But then again, it wasn't so much that Harold had noticed. It was that Ray had allowed himself to change. For the first time, he wasn't hiding behind his phone or his work. "I guess you could say that," Ray said slowly, his voice almost thoughtful. "I've started to take life a little slower. I'm trying not to rush through everything." Harold nodded approvingly, his eyes on the road. You know life isn't a race, Ray. It's more like a dance, and if you're always focused on the finish line, you're going to miss the rhythm. Ray's mind lingered on those words as the bus continued on its route. What did it mean to dance with life? To step in sync with the moments that came, instead of trying to force them into a schedule. Harold's metaphor was oddly comforting. As the bus rolled through the city streets, Ray's gaze drifted toward the faces of the other passengers. Everyone seemed to be in their own world, wrapped up in their routines, much like he had been not so long ago. But now, he wondered if they too were missing something. Had they, like him, been chasing after something intangible, only to find that the very thing they were after had been with them all along? The slow rhythm of the world, the way it asked you to pause, to look, to be present. Maybe, just maybe, it was enough to simply exist, to be in tune with the world around you, without the constant rush to the next goal. Ray spent the next few days actively practicing this new mindset. He was intentional with each task he approached, whether it was writing an email, attending a meeting, or simply interacting with a colleague. He found himself listening more, paying attention to the little things that he had long dismissed as trivial. He noticed the way the sunlight played through the office windows in the morning, the delicate hum of the coffee machine in the break room, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done without the frantic rush to finish it. It was during a particularly peaceful moment, as he sat in the small park near his office, that he realized how far he had come in such a short time. 2 weeks ago, he would have seen a lunch break as just another interruption, something to get through before he could dive back into work. But today, as he sat with his sandwich in hand, Ray found himself truly appreciating the brief respite. He let the cool breeze brush across his face, watched the children playing nearby, and felt the weight of the moment settle gently in his chest. That evening, Ray sat in his apartment, reflecting on how his life had transformed in such a short span of time. There had been no grand gestures, no drastic decisions that had altered the course of his future. Instead, it was the small moments, the subtle shifts in how he saw the world, that had made all the difference. He picked up his phone, intending to check his emails before heading to bed, but hesitated. He had been doing that less and less lately, and now it didn't feel necessary. He could be present without constantly checking his devices, without living in the future, always trying to anticipate the next step. Putting the phone down, he closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment to breathe. The best things, he thought again, like to play hide and seek. The quiet revolution. Ray's life had taken a turn that only a few weeks ago seemed inconceivable. He no longer felt the tight grip of ambition or the constant pressure to perform. For the first time in his career, he felt as though he were living in alignment with something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just about slowing down or disconnecting from the chaos. It was about rediscovering the value in the present moment, in the quiet spaces between his actions. And as he sat in his office one crisp autumn morning, a strange realization washed over him. He had changed not because he was trying to, but because he had been forced to confront what his life had become. The grind, the pressure, the endless pursuit of something bigger, better, faster. It was no longer sustainable. And yet, he found a curious peace in this understanding. There was something liberating in the act of letting go. It had been a week since Ray had last met with his team. Normally, this would have set off a cascade of worries in his mind. The ticking clock of missed opportunities, the looming deadlines that never seemed to wait for anyone. But now, as he entered the conference room for a long-awaited meeting, he felt an overwhelming sense of calm. His team members greeted him warmly, some with a hint of curiosity, others with genuine excitement. "Ray," Sarah said with a smile, "you look different today, in a good way." Ray chuckled, not sure how to respond to the growing attention. "I guess I've been doing some thinking, taking things a little slower." "A little slower," Tim, another colleague, piped up, his eyebrows raised. From the guy who lived and breathed the word hustle. This I've got to hear. Ray grinned, settling into his seat. You know, for the longest time, I thought hustle was everything. It was the only way to succeed. But I realized something. Chasing after the next big thing doesn't mean I'm actually moving forward. Sometimes it's about standing still long enough to understand where I've been, where I am, and where I'm actually trying to go. His words hung in the air, like a quiet revelation. The room fell silent for a moment, each person reflecting on what he had said. Ray could feel the shift happening within his team, a gentle acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, they had been chasing the wrong kind of success too. Over the next few days, Ray's new mindset started to ripple out, touching every corner of his life. Even his interactions with Anne began to change. Where there had once been a tension, an unspoken pressure to do more, achieve more, there was now an easy camaraderie. Anne, who had worked with Ray for years, had always been a silent observer of his internal struggle. She had witnessed firsthand his rise to the top, his sacrifices, and the toll it had taken on him. But now she saw something different in him, something freeing, something she hadn't seen in years. Ray, she said one morning, as they sat in the break room together, I've been meaning to ask you. You've been talking a lot about slowing down, but are you sure that's what you want? I mean, it's not just about taking more breaks, right? It's about making a real change. Ray considered her question for a moment. You're right, he said, looking down at his coffee cup. It's more than that. It's about living differently, not just existing. I've been so focused on the idea of success that I forgot to ask myself what I actually wanted out of life. Anne raised an eyebrow, her expression one of quiet curiosity. And what do you want? Ray looked her in the eye, his tone steady. I want to feel like I'm doing something meaningful, not just in my career, but in my life. I want to wake up and know that I'm contributing to something bigger than myself. And I want to enjoy the little moments, those ones I used to miss in the rush. Anne's lips curved into a soft smile. That sounds like the start of something new, something important. Ray nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest. Yeah, I think it is. But even as he made progress in rediscovering himself, there was still the inevitable pull of his old life. The calls, the meetings, the endless demand for his time and attention. It would have been so easy to fall back into his old ways, to slip into the comfort of his familiar routine, to let the momentum of his old habits take control. And for a moment, he was tempted. That temptation came one evening when he found himself staring at his phone, a new email notification lighting up the screen. It was from the board of directors. Urgent, with a request for a last-minute strategy session the following day. Ray's first instinct was to dive in, to read every word, to plan for the meeting as he always had. But then, something inside him stopped. He put the phone down and took a deep breath. The world would not end if he took a night off. In that moment, he realized that he didn't need to respond to every demand. He didn't need to be available 24/7. He didn't need to prove his worth by constantly being on. He was allowed to step back. That night, Ray took a walk in the park, something he hadn't done in years. The air was crisp, the city's lights shimmering in the distance, and the world seemed to slow around him. He passed by a couple sitting on a bench, laughing softly at something one of them had said. Their conversation wasn't about work or deadlines, or any of the things that consumed him daily. It was about nothing, just the joy of being together. Ray realized he had forgotten what it was like to simply be present with another person, to not be in a constant rush. As he walked, he thought about the last time he had truly connected with someone without thinking about time. When had he last sat down for a meal without checking his watch or his phone? When had he last simply listened instead of thinking about the next thing he had to say? The answers weren't easy. They were buried deep beneath the layers of ambition and achievement that had defined him for so long. But for the first time, Ray wasn't afraid to face that reality. The next day, Ray walked into the office with a sense of calm that felt almost foreign to him. The world was moving fast around him, but for once, he wasn't chasing it. He was simply a part of it. At the morning meeting, he surprised everyone, not by being late or distracted, but by being fully engaged in the conversation. He listened. He asked questions. He didn't interrupt. He allowed the ideas to flow naturally, without rushing to impose his own agenda. And for the first time, he felt truly connected to his team. As the meeting ended, Sarah pulled him aside. "Ray, I just wanted to say, I'm really impressed. You've changed. Not just how you're acting, but how you're listening. It's a different vibe, but a good one." Ray smiled, grateful for the acknowledgement. "I'm trying, Sarah. I'm learning to live slower, but with more intention. It's been eye-opening, honestly." Sarah gave him a thoughtful look. "It's a shift that's hard to make, but it's worth it. I think you're going to be a better leader because of it." Ray chuckled. "I hope so." As he walked back to his office, Ray felt something shift within him once again. His success was no longer measured by the number of hours worked or the speed with which he accomplished tasks. It was defined by the connections he made, the moments he experienced, and the lives he touched, not just in his work, but in every aspect of his life. The quiet revolution within him was just beginning, and for the first time, Ray felt ready to embrace it. The ripple effect. Ray's journey had transformed him. But as anyone who had undergone a personal metamorphosis knows, transformation is never a solitary event. It ripples outward, touching everything and everyone around you in ways you never anticipate. The more Ray leaned into this new way of living, this slower, more deliberate, and more intentional version of himself, the more he saw how his choices were influencing the people around him. At work, his newfound clarity and sense of purpose became contagious. His team began to reflect the same energy, the same thoughtful approach to their work. Meetings that had once been about checking boxes and ticking off to-do lists now centered around open dialogue and problem-solving. Ray encouraged them to speak up, to voice their concerns and their ideas, without fear of judgment or criticism. In turn, his team members began to value the moments they spent in each other's company, prioritizing collaboration over competition. But it wasn't just at work that Ray saw these changes taking place. His home life, too, became a canvas for this new way of being. He and Anne had always had a strong connection, but the deeper layers of their bond, the ones buried beneath years of routine and unspoken tension, began to emerge. They talked more, about everything and nothing, and with each conversation, they grew closer. Ray listened with a new kind of attentiveness, not just to Anne's words, but to her unspoken emotions, her needs, her fears. One evening after dinner, they sat together on the couch. The glow of the fireplace flickered in the background, casting soft shadows across the room. Anne turned to Ray, her voice thoughtful. "You know," she began, "I've noticed something in you. You've been so present lately. It's like you're here with me, in a way that I don't think you've been for a long time." Ray smiled, a deep sense of fulfillment settling in his chest. "I've been thinking about that too. I guess I was always so focused on the next thing that I never truly stopped to enjoy what I already had." Anne reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "And now you're here, with me, and it makes a difference." Ray's heart swelled. For so long, he had taken for granted the relationships that meant the most to him, assuming that they would always be there, just like his career and success. But now he realized, more than ever, that the people around him were the true markers of a life well lived. In the days that followed, Ray's changes didn't go unnoticed by his friends and family either. At a casual dinner gathering with old friends, he felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Conversations that used to revolve around the usual topics, work, the latest trends, the hustle, were replaced with more meaningful exchanges. They talked about what really mattered: their families, their passions, their personal growth. "You know, Ray," one of his friends, Mark, remarked between bites of dinner, "you've really slowed down, haven't you? You seem lighter, happier, even." Ray nodded. I guess I've realized that the whole race I was running wasn't leading anywhere I wanted to go. It's not about the destination, but the journey. And it's been nice to finally notice the scenery." Mark raised an eyebrow. "That's some deep stuff. Ray, you've always been the go-getter, but now it's like you've tapped into something more. I don't know what it is, but I can tell it's good." Ray smiled, but there was a quiet humility in his expression. "I think it's about understanding what's really important. And sometimes that's the things you can't measure with a paycheck or a promotion. It's about time. Time spent with the right people, doing the right things with purpose." But just as Ray was beginning to feel that his life had settled into a rhythm of peaceful balance, a phone call came that threatened to disrupt everything. It was from his old mentor, Richard Lawson, a name that had always carried weight in the corporate world. Richard had been the one to first teach Ray about the hustle, about working relentlessly to climb the ladder. He had been the one who showed Ray that success was a game, and the only way to win was to be constantly striving for more. "Ray, I need your help," Richard said urgently. "We've got a crisis on our hands. I know you're out of the game now, but this is your expertise. The company needs you." Ray hesitated. The familiar temptation of the corporate world, with all its promises of prestige and recognition, loomed before him. He could already feel the familiar pull of his old self, the Ray who was defined by what he could achieve. But that person felt distant now, like a stranger wearing his face. "I don't know, Richard," Ray replied, his voice calm. "I've been thinking a lot about the choices I've made recently, and I'm not sure if I want to jump back into that world. Not like that. Not without asking myself why I'm doing it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Richard, ever the pragmatist, had clearly not expected this response. "I get it, Ray," Richard finally said, his tone softer. "I know you've been through a lot of changes, but this is big. The company is on the brink of something huge. We could use someone with your experience." Ray took a deep breath. He knew the temptation was strong, that the allure of returning to the familiar comfort of his old life would be hard to resist. But he also knew that returning to that world meant abandoning the life he was building now, a life that was slower, quieter, and infinitely more fulfilling. "I appreciate it, Richard. I really do. But I'm not the person you need anymore." He hung up the phone, feeling a surprising sense of relief wash over him. The decision not to return to the corporate grind was a defining moment in Ray's journey. It wasn't just about rejecting an opportunity. It was about choosing something deeper, something that didn't come with a price tag or a deadline. For the first time in his life, Ray was learning how to say no to what no longer served him, and in doing so, he was creating the space to say yes to the life he truly wanted to live. And that was the ripple effect of his transformation. By shifting his own life, he had begun to shift the lives of others around him. Whether it was his team, his friends, or his family, his decision to slow down, to reconnect with his purpose, had created a wave of introspection that reached far beyond his own consciousness. It wasn't just about finding peace in his own life. It was about giving others permission to do the same. Ray understood now that this was the true measure of success, not in how much you could achieve, but in how much you could help others find their own peace, their own purpose. The corporate world had never taught him that. But life, real life, had. As he sat in his office the next morning, looking out at the city skyline, Ray felt a deep sense of gratitude. His journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. And it was a path he would walk, not in a hurry, but with intention, purpose, and a quiet confidence. The ripple effect had only just begun. Ray's decision to turn down Richard's offer wasn't the end of his transformation. It was the beginning of a new phase in his journey, one that would require him to become even more vulnerable, to embrace uncertainty with open arms, and to trust that the path he was forging would lead him to places he had never imagined. At work, the changes were subtle but profound. The numbers were still there, still good, still solid, But Ray's team now felt more like a close-knit group of problem solvers, not just employees grinding away at targets. They began to look at each other less as colleagues who were meant to deliver results for a paycheck, and more as teammates united by a common vision of purpose. He found himself starting every meeting with a question instead of an agenda. What's something that's been on your mind this week? That simple question often sparked unexpected conversations about personal challenges, dreams, or frustrations. The answers weren't always work-related, but they always seemed to bring out a deeper level of connection. For the first time, Ray felt that his role as a leader wasn't just about steering the ship toward financial success. It was about making sure everyone on the team had the support they needed to find their own balance between personal and professional life. He found ways to challenge them, but in a way that didn't feel like pressure. It felt like a shared commitment to growth. It wasn't just the people at work who were noticing his change. Even in his personal life, things were evolving in ways Ray hadn't expected. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, Ray found himself sitting at his dining table with Anne, both of them sipping on glasses of wine. She had been listening intently to him talk about the shifts happening at work, his more mindful approach to leadership, his efforts to create a more supportive environment for his team. And she could tell that something had shifted in him that went far beyond just his career. "You seem different, Ray," she said, her eyes scanning his face. "I don't know how to describe it, but it's like you're finally at peace with yourself. With us." Ray smiled, a little taken aback. He had been so focused on changing his work life, on becoming the kind of person he had always admired, that he hadn't stopped to think about how this might affect his relationship with Anne. "I feel like I'm finally being honest with myself," he said softly. "I was always so focused on being successful, but I never stopped to ask myself why. Why was I pushing so hard? What was I really after? It was like I was running in circles, constantly chasing the next thing, and I never stopped to appreciate what I already had. And that's something I don't want to miss anymore." Anne's eyes softened as she placed her hand over his. "I've seen that in you lately. You're not the same man who left for work every morning in a hurry, the one who couldn't focus on anything but the next deadline. Now it's like you're truly present. With me. With everyone." Ray looked at her, feeling the warmth spread through him. "I think I've been realizing that the things I used to chase, success, recognition, all of it, don't really matter if the people around you don't feel valued. I've spent so much time building up this idea of what I should be doing, but in the process, I've missed out on the most important thing of all. The people who matter. The time I have with you. With my team. With friends." Anne smiled, leaning forward and kissing him gently on the cheek. "I'm proud of you, Ray. This isn't easy, but I see the difference in you. I see the man you're becoming." Ray's heart swelled with emotion. He realized then that the shift he had been experiencing wasn't just about career or work life. It was about the relationships that had always been there, but had been clouded by his constant pursuit of an undefined goal. For the first time, he truly understood that his worth wasn't defined by his job title, his salary, or his achievements. It was defined by the impact he had on the lives of others, the people he cared about, and the people he worked with. The next morning, Ray found himself standing in front of the mirror in his office, staring at his reflection with a new sense of clarity. The man looking back at him was different, calmer, more grounded, more focused on the present than the future. He wasn't the same young man who had always been in a rush, the one who believed that success meant sacrificing his happiness, his relationships, his well-being. He had learned the hard way that no promotion, no amount of money, no recognition was worth losing himself in the process. He had learned that real success, true fulfillment, was about living in alignment with his values, being present, being mindful, and being kind to those around him. Ray took a deep breath, letting the weight of this realization settle into his bones. He wasn't perfect. He had his flaws, his mistakes, his moments of doubt. But for the first time in a long time, he was content with where he was. He was no longer chasing an elusive ideal of success that kept slipping through his fingers. He had found something more valuable: the freedom to live authentically, to be true to himself. And it wasn't just a feeling, it was a choice. Every single day, Ray chose to slow down. He chose to be present. He chose to listen, to learn, to grow. And with each choice, he became the man he had always wanted to be. Not the man defined by his work, but the man defined by his purpose, his relationships, and his integrity. Later that week, as he stepped off the bus, Ray saw Harold standing at the front. As usual, greeting passengers with a warm smile and a cheerful, "Have a blessed day." But this time, Ray didn't just walk by him without a second thought. Instead, he stopped. "Morning, Harold," Ray said, his voice genuine. Harold turned to him, that same serene smile spreading across his face. "Good morning, young man. How's everything going today?" Ray took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to fully appreciate the simplicity of the moment, the shared humanity between them. "It's going well," Ray said. "I've been thinking a lot about things, actually. And I wanted to thank you for the way you carry yourself. It's made a difference to me." Harold's eyes twinkled with understanding. "We all need reminders, son. Sometimes it's the small things, patience, kindness, that can change everything." Ray nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude toward this man who had no idea how much his attitude had impacted Ray's life. He knew now that Harold was not just a bus driver. He was a reminder that success wasn't about achieving more, but about being more. As Ray walked away, he felt lighter than he had in years. For the first time in his life, he was walking at his own pace, with his head held high, not because of what he had accomplished, but because of who he had become. And as the bus drove off into the distance, Ray Thompson understood, with a deep sense of peace, that the true measure of success isn't found in the title you hold, the salary you earn, or the recognition you receive. It's found in the way you live, the way you love, and the way you impact the world around you. That was the real success, and Ray was finally, truly living it.